you're speaking of because this goes along the line of self-defense. I wanted to ask you about Article 51 of the UN Charter because, again, for the viewers, those who don't know, in the UN Charter, Article 51 pertains to the right to self-defense, so either individual or collective. And I saw your great piece in Consortium News. I saw some of your tweets as well. And this is a genuine question that I have because, you know, I see the United States and Israel invoke Article 51 when they bomb Syria or they bomb Iraq. No one seems to mind that. Here, Russia also invoked Article 51. If I'm not mistaken, you believe that they are correct to do so, and they have the actual legal justification to do it. Why do you think so? How can we rationalize and reconcile this with Article 51? Because the rest of the world, or let's say the Western world, says Russia's violating international law. Is it really? Like, if it's invoking Article 51?
Well, let's just start with the basics. The greatest war crime of all is the illegal war of aggression. That's not me saying that. That's the Nuremberg military tribunal after the Second World War condemning Germans to die for the crime of promoting illegal war of aggression. And from this came the United Nations Charter, which sought to ban conflict. That's one of the, you're not allowed to go to war. Yep. But they recognize humans being humans, that we're going to go to war. But there's only two conditions that are set by the United Nations Charter that are exceptions to the ban on conflict. One is a Chapter 7 resolution passed by the Security Council that authorizes military force to be used to resolve a threat to international peace and security. The war I fought in, the 1991 conflict with Iraq, was authorized by a Chapter 7 resolution saying that the world was authorized to respond militarily to remove Iraq from Kuwait, which had invaded and occupied in August of 1990. Now, people can be against the war. They can say whatever they want, and I respect that. You can't call it an illegal war. It was not an illegal war. You can say it was an unjust war, da-da-da. Please, go ahead. But it's not illegal. Now we come to Article 51. Article 51 is self-defense. And this is the one that basically says that if you're attacked, you have a right to defend yourself. It also talks about collective self-defense. So if you're attacked, people are allowed to come to your assistance, to assist you. But it's predicated on the notion that you have been attacked. And someone will say, well, wait a minute, Ritter. Russia wasn't attacked by Ukraine. How come Russia gets to invoke Article 51? Now we come into the concept of preemptive self-defense. And this is actually an old concept under customary law and such. In fact, one of the key cases for this is an incident in American history, 1837, called the Caroline Affair, where an American ship was preemptively attacked by a British war vessel because the British said the Americans were getting ready to provide assistance to Canadian rebels. And therefore, the British had no choice but to attack the Americans first. And so the exchange of notes between the United States and Great Britain under the Caroline Affair became sort of the legitimacy of the concept of preemption. But a key aspect of preemption is the notion of imminence, that there has to be an imminent threat that leaves you no choice but to act now, as opposed to there's a threat here, but I could actually go to the United Nations and try and get a Chapter 7 resolution to get people to come to my assistance. So I don't need to attack today. So the issue of imminence comes in. There's also the issue of jurisdiction. How did Russia justify Article 51? Well, the first thing they did is they talked about the notion of collective defense. And what they mean by that is that they are aligned with the newly independent republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. Because without that, people will say, well, wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, even under Russia's geopolitical analysis, are part of Ukraine. So how can Russia come to the defense of Ukraine to protect it from Ukraine? Article 51 would fail there. But now that these are independent nations, Russia can articulate that claim. But people will then say, but wait a minute, Lugansk and Donetsk, they're not United Nations members. So how can they suddenly talk about United Nations rights, but they're not United Nations members? Now we come to collective defense. And fortunately for Russia, NATO has provided a wonderful case study, because in 1999, NATO attacked Serbia, citing Article 51. Now, NATO is not a member of the United Nations. How can they do that? Under the notion of collective defense, that NATO assumed the character of a mutual defense alliance arrangement. And therefore, that collective can speak of preemptively attacking to defend the collective against an imminent threat. The imminent threat, of course, being Serbia. Now, NATO hyped up the threat, called it genocide when it wasn't genocide, but that's a different issue. The bottom line, though, is that NATO justified their actions against Serbia under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, using collective defense in a non-UN member state association. So Russia comes in and says, we are now affiliated with Lugansk and Donetsk in a collective defense matter, and we are coming to their defense over the Ukrainian attacks that have been taking place for the past 8 years in the Donbass. But now you'll even say, well, okay, even if we buy into this, Ritter, and you have to because that's sort of the law, that doesn't justify them going against Ukraine. And it justifies them defending Lugansk and Donetsk, a limited military operation. Now we come to the other thing. Russia says, yes, but Ukraine has been massing their forces opposite Donetsk and opposite the Donbass, 100 to 120,000 of their best troops. And they were preparing an attack on the Donbass to recapture it. And therefore, we had to preempt that attack with a larger military incursion, the special military operation. And when we decide to expand that, we had no choice then but to take into the totality of Ukraine, because if we simply fight a battle against the 120,000 troops, that frees up Ukraine to bring the rest of their military down on us, and that would create a disadvantage for us. So we had to expand the scope and scale of our operation to include the feint in Kiev, to include the fixing operation at Kharkiv, to include the assault out of Kherson, the land bridge, and the air campaign to neutralize everything. All now are linked to collective self-defense, because Ukraine was getting ready to launch an attack against Donbass, and Russia had to preempt that. The other thing that Russia used as an issue of preemption was Zelensky's misguided statements to the Munich Security Council, where he said, we need to get out of the non-proliferation treaty and we need to acquire nuclear weapons.
Basically.
And Russia went, we have intelligence that you may in fact be trying to do that. So they added a WMD clause to their justification, and they moved in. I don't know what the viability of their intelligence is, but what I can say is, in Chernobyl and in the other nuclear power plant that they took control of down south, there are giant pools of water that contain spent uranium fuel rods. These are highly radioactive waste that could be ground up, mixed with high explosives to create a dirty bomb.
Right.
And the Russians claim to have intelligence that the Ukrainians were at least considering doing this. They also had intelligence that said that in these depleted uranium fuel rods, or the spent fuel rods, 10% of their weight is actually plutonium-239, which is used for nuclear weapons. And that if the Ukrainians wanted to extract the plutonium-239, they could then have the fissile core necessary to produce a nuclear weapon. So therefore, we need to gain control over these ponds to make sure that this isn't happening. And there was an imminent need, citing Zelensky's own statement at the Munich Security Conference. So that's another element of imminence that's added to this. And I think combined, we see that Russia has articulated a cognizable case for genuine Article 51 authorization, as opposed, for instance, to the United States, who invaded Iraq in 2003, citing the imminent threat of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and the nexus between an Iraqi government possessing weapons of mass destruction and al-Qaeda terrorism. Both of those turned out to be false. So the United States lied to set up a artificial predicate for preemption under Article 51. So the United States case is 100% invalid. It turns out that the Russians actually have a pretty sound case derived by fact, far more valid than any case that either NATO or the United States made involving issues of preemption.
Yeah, it's interesting because all these steps that you mentioned, it is kind of taking a page out of the NATO playbook, except that it's actually cognizable, as you said. There's actually something to it, whichever one you want to look at.